Here is something keeping emergency planners awake at night. While Super Typhoon Sinlaku was tightening into a 180 mph Category 5 monster, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake struck near Guam. Coincidence, probably. But the Mariana Trench sitting directly underneath this storm's path is one of the most seismically active subduction zones on Earth. And when you stack that geological reality on top of 170,000 Americans, with zero evacuation options and an island infrastructure system that cannot fail partially, only completely, the worst-case scenarios stop being theoretical very fast. Sinlaku is expected to make landfall on Guam by Tuesday. That is less than 24 hours from now. So we are laying out every worst-case scenario tonight, not to fearmonger, but so that people on the ground know exactly what they could be facing and can prepare, while there is still time. From the 60% probability baseline to the one that has no modern precedent, we are going to walk through every single one of them. And even if you're not in Sinlaku's path tomorrow, you'll want to stick around, because what it reveals about this year's climate should concern everyone. Do not go anywhere. This one matters more than you think. If you enjoy what we do here, hit like and subscribe to Project Nightwatch, because Sinlaku is not done, and we will be here for every moment of it. If you are in Sinlaku's path right now, Guam, Rota, Tinian, Saipan, drop a comment and tell us how you are preparing. What supplies have you stocked? Where are you sheltering? What is the mood on the ground? We want to hear from the people actually living this. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The 180 mph moment. There is a moment in every major typhoon's life when the meteorologists stop forecasting and start calculating damage. Sinlaku crossed that line about 48 hours ago, and right now, 12 hours from landfall, we are not watching a weather event anymore. We are watching physics deliver an invoice. Let's establish exactly what we're dealing with, because the numbers matter here. Sustained winds of 180 miles per hour, gusts reaching 220 miles per hour, a central pressure reading near 888 millibars, a number that, if you know anything about tropical cyclones, should make your stomach drop. For context, the lowest pressure ever recorded in a Western Pacific typhoon was 870 millibar, set by Typhoon Tip back in 1979. Sinlaku is not Tip. But it is in that neighbourhood, and that neighbourhood does not have good schools or friendly streets. It is the kind of pressure reading that tells you the atmosphere itself has organised into something that operates more like a heat engine than a storm. The eye is tightening, the eye wall is contracting, and the Rota-Tinian corridor is sitting almost directly in its path. Here is what rapid intensification actually means, because the term gets thrown around and people nod and move on without really feeling the horror of it. Rapid intensification is officially defined as a wind speed increase of at least 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. Sinlaku did not just meet that threshold. It went from a tropical depression to a Category 5 equivalent in roughly 96 hours. That is not a storm growing up. That is a storm being handed a cheat code. Warm sea surface temperatures, low wind shear, high atmospheric moisture, everything that a developing cyclone could possibly want was sitting in that patch of ocean, and Sinlaku absorbed it all with terrifying efficiency. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center upgraded it through every classification with almost no hesitation, and when they issued the TCCOR1 status, the Tropical Cyclone Condition of Readiness 1, it meant one specific thing. Destructive winds are imminent within 12 hours. Not approaching, not possible, imminent. Now, the islands sitting in Sinlaku's path right now are Rota, Tinian and Saipan, and together with Guam they represent the full weight of American presence in the Western Pacific. And here is where the central problem of this entire story begins to take shape. This is not simply a storm threatening people who can get in their cars and drive inland. There are approximately 170,000 Americans spread across this island chain, and not a single one of them has any realistic option to leave. The geometry of the Pacific made the decision for them days ago, before most people even knew Sinlaku's name. We will get to exactly why escape was never on the table in a moment, but hold that thought, because it changes everything about how you interpret every other number in this story. To understand what Sinlaku means in historical terms, you have to place it on the same shelf as the storms that came before it. Super Typhoon Yutu in 2018 made direct landfall on Saipan and Tinian, with sustained winds around 170 miles per hour. and it left the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in ruins for months. Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 killed more than 6,000 people in the Philippines and generated wind gusts near 215 miles per hour, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. Super Typhoon Goni in 2020 struck the Philippines with 160 mile per hour sustained winds and was briefly the most powerful landfalling tropical cyclone ever recorded. Sinlaku sits near the top of that company, and it is heading toward US territory with infrastructure that, as we are going to explore in uncomfortable detail, is not built to survive what is coming. The psychological shift that happens between the warning phase and the impact phase is something emergency managers talk about but rarely explain well to the public. During the warning phase, there is still optionality. You can prepare, you can reinforce, you can evacuate if the evacuation route exists. The moment TCCOR1 is issued, that optionality collapses. The decisions have all been made. Whatever preparations were completed are the preparations that exist. Whatever structures are standing are the structures that will face the wind. And whoever is still on those islands is going to be there when the eyewall arrives. Sinlaku is no longer a forecast. It is a countdown to a physics experiment that 170,000 Americans are about to participate in involuntarily. And the reason this storm is so much more than a weather event, the reason it functions as a stress test for an entire interlocked system of infrastructure, logistics, geology, and strategy, is precisely because of where it is hitting and what it is hitting, and how completely the geography has removed every comfortable exit from this scenario. One rapidly intensifying Category 5 storm, one isolated US island chain, 170,000 people who are about to find out whether American territory can endure what the Western Pacific is capable of delivering. Part 2. The Mariana Trap. Most people, when they think about natural disasters, think about singular events with clear before and after states. The storm hits, the damage happens, the recovery begins. What makes the Marianas situation categorically different is that the geography itself transforms a meteorological event into something closer to a siege. And sieges, by definition, are not won or lost in a single moment. They are won or lost by logistics, by supply chains, by time, and by whether the people inside the perimeter have what they need to survive until relief arrives. Sinlaku is the opening move in what could become a months-long endurance test, and the geography made that choice, not the storm. Let's talk about the physical isolation, because the numbers are striking in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. The nearest major city to the Mariana Islands is roughly 1,500 miles away, depending on whether you're measuring to Manila or to Tokyo. The continental United States is 6,000 miles to the east. 6,000 miles. To put that in an American driving context, that is roughly the distance from Los Angeles to New York and back again, and then New York to Chicago on top of that. Federal disaster response, no matter how well coordinated, has to move people, equipment, and supplies across that gap after a storm that will likely have degraded or destroyed the very infrastructure those supplies need to reach. The math does not cooperate. Now consider the evacuation question, because people always ask it, and the answer is one that emergency planners have quietly accepted, even if it is not politically comfortable to say out loud. There is no meaningful evacuation option for the Mariana Islands under a rapid intensification scenario like this one. Aircraft can move people out at a rate measured in the hundreds per day under ideal conditions. The population requiring evacuation is measured in the hundreds of thousands. The math fails before you finish the sentence, and Sinlaku's rapid intensification specifically collapsed the timeline that would have made even a partial evacuation meaningful. By the time the storm's track and intensity became clear enough to justify mass movement, the weather window for safe air operations was already closing. Typhoons do not give you the luxury of a slow-building consensus before they demand a decision. The supply chain reality on these islands is another piece of the trap. Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands receive the majority of their goods, food, fuel, medicine, building materials, through weekly shipping cycles that move through Apra Harbour. That single port is the metabolic system of the island chain. Every car, every generator, every hospital supply, every fuel drum moves through that choke point. When a Category 5 typhoon shuts down port operations, and it will shut them down, the islands do not simply experience inconvenience. They begin drawing down reserves that were never designed for extended isolation in the first place. Fuel gets used by generators powering critical systems. Food supplies that assumed weekly resupply start running short, and the window before that matters is not months, it is days. The airport situation is equally constrained. Under normal conditions, Antonio B. won Pat International Airport on Guam and Francisco C. Ada Saipan. International Airport are the air gateways for the entire region. During a typhoon, they close. After a typhoon, their usability depends on the condition of runways, equipment, fuel supplies, and air traffic control infrastructure, all of which are vulnerable to exactly the kind of damage Sinlaku is about to deliver. The window between when the storm passes and when meaningful airlift operations can resume is measured in days at minimum, and during that window, the islands are effectively cut off from external assistance at scale. Historical precedent makes this concrete rather than theoretical. When Super Typhoon U2 struck Saipan and Tinian in 2018, recovery did not arrive quickly or cleanly. Blackouts lasted for months in some areas. FEMA coordination took time to scale up across the geographic gap. The lesson from U2 is not that the response failed, it is that the geography guarantees a delay between disaster and meaningful outside help that no amount of good intentions can fully eliminate. Sinlaku, if it performs at its current intensity, has the potential to produce a longer, deeper version of that same isolation gap. And that is the mechanism by which a storm transforms into a survival crisis rather than simply a damage event. The question is not just what breaks, it is how long the broken state persists before the outside world can bridge the 6,000-mile gap. What breaks first, and in what order, is where the story gets genuinely alarming. Part 3. The Hidden Instability Layer. While Sinlaku was tightening its eye wall somewhere in the Philippine Sea, something else happened that most news coverage mentioned briefly and then moved past. A magnitude 4.5 earthquake struck near Guam. Not a catastrophic event on its own. Not the kind of earthquake that makes international headlines under normal circumstances, but the timing and the location and the geological context underneath it are worth spending a few minutes on, because they add a layer to this story that goes beyond wind and water. The Mariana Islands do not sit on stable ground. They sit at one of the most geologically active convergence zones on the surface of the planet. The Pacific Plate, moving roughly in the direction of the Philippines, is being driven underneath the Mariana Plate in what geologists call a subduction zone, and the result is the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on the ocean floor, more than 36,000 feet below sea level. The same process that carved that trench is also the reason the Mariana Islands exist at all. They are the visible surface expression of volcanic and tectonic activity that has been operating for millions of years. Which means the islands that Sinlaku is approaching are, geologically speaking, the tips of enormous underwater volcanoes sitting on top of one of the most seismically active boundaries on Earth. The magnitude 4.5 near Guam was a deep slab event, roughly 100 kilometers down, which puts it in the category of earthquakes that cause little surface damage on their own. An additional magnitude 5.0 was recorded near the Pagan region of the Northern Marianas around the same time. Neither of these events in isolation would warrant much concern. Background seismicity in the Marianas is normal. The Pacific Ring of Fire produces thousands of small earthquakes every week across its full arc, and the Marianas are a regular contributor to that count. Scientists are careful, and correctly so, to note that there is no established causal mechanism linking typhoon pressure changes to triggered seismic events at depth. The idea that a storm can cause an earthquake is not supported by current evidence, and it is important to say that clearly. What is worth noting, however, is the concept of coincidental hazard stacking. Two independent physical systems, each operating on their own timescale and driven by their own forces, can overlap in time and space without either one causing the other. And when they do overlap, the combined effect on human infrastructure can be non-linear in ways that single hazard planning does not account for. A building that has already experienced roof uplift stress from sustained wind loading may respond differently to ground motion than it would under seismic loading alone. Ground that has been saturated by extreme rainfall becomes more susceptible to slope failure during shaking. These interactions are not speculative, they have been documented in compound disaster research, and the Philippines, which shares many of the same geological and meteorological characteristics as the Marianas, has experienced exactly this kind of layered event multiple times. The deeper point here connects directly back to the central problem Sinlaku is forcing onto the table. A single storm is manageable as a category of event even when that storm is historically powerful. Systems, infrastructure, and populations are designed around single hazard baselines. What Sinlaku is doing, in real time, is arriving as one component of a multi-system stress window, a period in which the atmospheric, geological, and logistical vulnerabilities of these islands are simultaneously activated. The earthquake may not cause the bridge to fail, but the wind did something to that bridge first, and the rain did something to the ground underneath it, and then the shaking arrived into a structure that was no longer operating at its original design parameters. That is not a worst-case fantasy, that is compound disaster physics, and it is why the emergency planners tracking Sinlaku are watching more than just the wind speed. What those planners also know, and what most people have not fully processed yet, is that the wind itself is only the first system to break. The ones that follow are much harder to see coming. Part 4. Wind versus infrastructure collapse physics. Here is something that almost never gets explained correctly in typhoon coverage, and it matters enormously for understanding what Sinlaku is about to do. Wind is not the failure mode. Wind is the trigger. The failure mode is what happens to interconnected systems when enough individual components are removed by the wind in the right sequence. A Category 5 typhoon does not destroy a modern island's infrastructure the way a wrecking ball destroys a building, all at once, in a single dramatic collapse. It destroys infrastructure the way a power outage destroys a hospital, quietly, progressively, in a cascade where each failure creates the conditions for the next one. Let's start with the physics of what 160 miles per hour sustained winds actually do to structures, because the engineering thresholds are specific and worth understanding. Roof uplift begins to become catastrophic for standard residential and commercial construction, somewhere around 120 to 140 miles per hour sustained wind loading. At those speeds, the pressure differential between the top and bottom of a roof, the positive pressure pushing against the walls and the negative pressure pulling the roof upward, exceeds the design capacity of standard fastening systems. Shingles go first, then the underlayment. Then, if the connection between the roof deck and the wall framing is inadequate, the roof itself separates and becomes a projectile. This is not a fringe outcome at 160 miles per hour. It is the statistical expectation, and once a building loses its roof, rain enters, contents are destroyed, the structural walls lose the lateral bracing the roof provided, and the cascade inside that individual structure begins. Scale that to an island where the power transmission infrastructure is approximately 78 to 81% overhead lines. Those lines are strung between poles that were designed to withstand wind speeds up to a defined standard. That standard varies, but in the context of Guam and the CNMI, even upgraded lines face extreme difficulty surviving a direct Category 5 eyewall passage. The physics is straightforward. A transmission tower or distribution pole fails when the wind force on the line exceeds the structural moment capacity of the support structure. At 180 miles per hour, you're applying roughly 4 times the force of a 100 mile per hour wind, because aerodynamic loading scales with the square of velocity. Structures that survived a Category 3 barely need to recalculate entirely when the Category 5 arrives. Lines come down, poles snap, and with them, the power grid collapses, not section by section in a manageable rolling outage, but in a cascade that can drop an entire island's electrical system in hours. Now follow that power loss downstream, because this is where the cascade becomes a survival problem rather than an inconvenience. Water systems on Guam and across the CNMI rely on electrically powered pumping stations to move water through distribution networks and to maintain pressure for fire suppression and household use. No power means no pump pressure. No pump pressure means hospitals cannot run sterilization systems, cannot maintain cooling for medications, cannot operate surgical suites, dialysis patients cannot receive treatment, residents cannot access potable water, and within 72 to 96 hours, roughly the window before generator fuel runs out for facilities that have generators at all, the cascade reaches the medical system, which was the last line of defense against the storm's secondary consequences. Communications towers have their own dependency chain. They need power, and most have battery backup systems designed for relatively short outages, 8 to 12 hours in many configurations. Generators extend that window, but generators need fuel, and fuel supply becomes problematic when the port is shut down and resupply routes are blocked. The communications blackout that follows is not just an inconvenience for people trying to call their families, it is a catastrophic coordination failure for emergency response, for medical triage, for search and rescue logistics, for the moment-to-moment decisions that keep a post-storm population from sliding from crisis into catastrophe. This is the concept that emergency systems theorists sometimes call sequential unthreading, the process by which a complex, tightly coupled system begins to fail not all at once, but in a sequence where each failed component removes a backstop that the next component was relying on. Power fails, water fails, communications degrade, medical systems strain, fuel reserves deplete, and each failure happens on a different timeline, which creates the illusion that the situation is stable between collapses. It is not stable, it is between collapses, and Sinlaku, at its current intensity, is capable of triggering that sequence across an entire archipelago simultaneously. The proof of concept, unfortunately, already exists, and it happened on these same islands 7 years ago. Part 5. The U2 Benchmark. Super Typhoon. U2 made landfall on Saipan and Tinian on October 25, 2018. It is worth pausing on that date because U2 was not some ancient historical event available only in archived newspapers. 2018, less than a decade ago. The people who lived through it are still there. Many of them are living in the same rebuilt or partially rebuilt structures that Sinlaku is now approaching. And what U2 did to Saipan and Tinian is the closest thing we have to a documented proof of concept for what a direct Category 5 strike means in real terms for these specific islands. U2's peak sustained winds at landfall were approximately 170 miles per hour, making it the strongest typhoon to strike US territory in recorded history at the time. What came out the other side of that windfield was not a damaged island, it was a functionally destroyed one. More than 6,000 homes were damaged or destroyed across Saipan and Tinian. The CNMI power grid collapsed almost entirely. Months, not days, months, passed before anything approaching normal electrical service was restored to significant portions of the population. The economic damage estimate crossed $800 million, and that figure likely understated the actual cost when you factor in indirect economic disruption, tourism losses, and the long-term depopulation effect as residents who could leave did leave during the extended recovery period. The important thing to understand about U2 in the context of Sinlaku is not that U2 proves destruction is inevitable. It is that U2 proves the cascade failure model is not theoretical. It happened. The grid went down completely. The water systems failed. The communications infrastructure was severely degraded. FEMA operations were essential for months, not days, and even with federal support, the recovery timeline was measured in seasons, not weeks. The islands did not snap back. They absorbed the damage and began a slow reconstruction process that was still ongoing when the next typhoon season arrived. Now look at the differential between U2 and Sinlaku. U2's sustained winds were approximately 170 miles per hour. Sinlaku's current sustained winds are 180 miles per hour, with gusts to 220. 10 additional miles per hour of sustained wind does not sound like much until you remember that aerodynamic force scales as the square of velocity. That 10 mile per hour difference represents a meaningful additional load on every structure, every transmission line, every communication tower the storm encounters. And beyond the intensity differential, Sinlaku appears to have a broader wind field, meaning the zone of damaging winds extends further from the centre than U2's did. A wider wind field means more total area exposed to structural damage thresholds, more transmission infrastructure in the failure zone, more simultaneous disruption across multiple islands at the same time. U2 demonstrated what happens when one island, Tinian, takes a direct hit while Saipan takes a near-direct hit. The result was a multi-month regional emergency that strained federal response capacity and left tens of thousands of Americans in genuinely difficult circumstances for a very long time. Sinlaku's track puts multiple islands, potentially including Guam, inside meaningful impact zones simultaneously. And here is the detail that connects directly to the larger system-level story. Guam is not just a larger version of Saipan. Guam contains the infrastructure that the rest of the region depends on. What U2 showed us about one island is the baseline. What Sinlaku could show us about the entire Mariana chain is something that, as far as documented US disaster history goes, we have not seen before. And the reason that matters strategically, not just humanistically, brings us to a layer of this story that rarely makes it into the weather coverage. Part 6. The military layer nobody talks about. There is a version of the Sinlaku story that is entirely about civilians, about residential buildings and hospital generators and FEMA response timelines, and that version is important and true. But there is another version running in parallel that strategic analysts and defence planners are watching very carefully right now, and it does not get nearly enough attention in mainstream disaster coverage. Andersen Air Force Base sits on the northern end of Guam. Naval Base Guam and Apra Harbour sit on the western coast. Together, they represent the United States' most critical military logistics hub in the Western Pacific, the forward operating platform from which bomber operations, submarine patrols, fleet refueling, and rapid response to any Pacific contingency are coordinated. Andersen is not a small installation. It is the staging point for B-52 and B-2 bomber deployments across the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. Its runways and fuel storage infrastructure support a significant portion of US long-range strike capability in the theatre. Naval Base Guam handles submarine tenders, surface combatants, and the fuel and supply logistics that keep forward-deployed naval forces operational at distance from the continental United States. These are not redundant systems with easy backups in the region. If Andersen loses runway operability, if Apra Harbour becomes unusable, the operational reach of US forces in the Western Pacific compresses in ways that create a window, temporary but real, of degraded capability. Typhoon Mawar in 2023 provided a preview of this dynamic when it passed near Guam and forced partial readiness degradation across both installations. Aircraft were repositioned, operations were suspended, and the temporary gap in regional air presence was noted with some concern by strategic observers. Mawar was not a direct hit. Sinlaku's track puts the threat in a categorically different position. A direct Category 5 eyewall passage over Guam would test Andersen and Naval Base Guam in ways that have not been tested in the modern era of American military presence on the island. The coupling between civilian and military infrastructure is tighter than most people realise. Andersen and Naval Base Guam draw power from Guam Power Authority infrastructure, which is the same grid serving the civilian population. Apra Harbour's operational capacity depends on the same fuel and logistics networks that civilian shipping uses. When the civilian grid collapses under Sinlaku's wind loading, the military installations shift to their own backup power systems, but those systems have capacity limits, fuel consumption rates, and maintenance requirements that extend indefinitely if external resupply is delayed by port damage or airfield degradation. The military is not isolated from the cascade, it is embedded in it. What this adds to the central story Sinlaku is telling is a layer of strategic significance beyond the humanitarian emergency. A storm that collapses Guam's infrastructure for weeks or months does not just hurt civilians. It creates a measurable gap in Western Pacific operational capacity at a moment when that capacity carries significant geopolitical weight. The repair timelines for military infrastructure often extend beyond civilian recovery cycles because specialized equipment and hardened systems require contractors, parts, and expertise that cannot simply be airlifted in on the first cargo flight after a typhoon. The system-level fragility that Sinlaku is exposing is not just about whether people have electricity or water. It is about whether the forward deterrence architecture of the United States in the Pacific can be knocked offline by a single weather event, and how long the answer to that question remains uncomfortable. Part 7. Baseline Catastrophe. Let's talk about probability, because worst-case scenario analysis is only useful if you ground it in what is actually likely versus what is theoretically possible. There is a spectrum here, and it runs from the devastatingly bad to the genuinely unprecedented, and the place to start is the scenario that emergency planners consider the highest probability outcome. Call it the baseline catastrophe, the outcome that sits somewhere between 60 and 80% probability, given Sinlaku's current track and intensity. It is catastrophic, and the word baseline should not make it sound routine. Baseline here means the most likely version of an event that will cause extraordinary suffering and require an extraordinary federal response. When emergency planners use the word baseline, they are not describing something manageable. They are describing the floor, the minimum, the outcome you get if nothing else goes wrong. The scenario looks like this. Sinlaku's eyewall makes primary contact with Rota, Tinian, and Saipan in the CNMI. The islands experience sustained winds in the 130 to 160 miles per hour range across the main impact zone, with higher values possible near the eye wall. That wind range is not an abstraction. At 130 miles per hour, you're already above the threshold at which standard residential construction begins experiencing catastrophic roof failure. At 160, you're in territory where the question is no longer whether structures survive but how many do not. The difference between those two numbers on a wind speed chart looks small. The difference on the ground, measured in destroyed homes and displaced families, is enormous, and the eye wall of Sinlaku at its current intensity sits above both of them. Storm surge along low-lying coastal areas reaches somewhere between 15 and 25 feet above normal sea level. Read that number again slowly because it is easy to hear it and not feel it. 15 to 25 feet. That is not water lapping at a doorstep. That is water swallowing a two-story building to its roofline. And on islands, where a significant portion of infrastructure and population is concentrated near the coast, because that is where ports are, where roads run, where hospitals were built, where fuel depots were sited decades ago when storm surge modelling was not what it is today. That means inundation of hospitals, fuel depots, communications facilities, and residential neighbourhoods simultaneously. Not sequentially, where you might manage one before the next arrives. Simultaneously, everything that matters, underwater, at the same time. Rainfall accumulation of 6 to 12 inches across the primary impact zone, with localised extreme bursts well above that threshold in favoured upslope areas, saturates soils and triggers flash flooding in valleys and low-lying areas that are already receiving storm surge from the coast. This is the part of typhoon coverage that gets the least attention and causes some of the most harm. The wind is the headline, the surge is the photograph. The rainfall is the thing that keeps killing after the wind stops and the cameras move on. Saturated soils mean slopes fail. Saturated soils mean roads that survive the wind become impassable under standing water. Saturated soils mean the ground underneath already stressed structures is no longer providing the foundation support those structures were designed to rely on. 6 to 12 inches across an island chain that has no inland high ground to drain toward is not a rainfall event. It is a transformation of the landscape. The power grid fails. This is not a projection or a worst case. It is the statistical expectation under Category 4 to 5 wind loading given the overhead line exposure across the CNMI. Approximately 78 to 81% of the power transmission infrastructure across these islands runs on overhead lines. Those lines do not survive an eye wall passage at these wind speeds. The physics does not allow it. Aerodynamic loading scales with the square of wind velocity, which means the force on a transmission pole at 160 miles per hour is not 60% more than at 100 miles per hour. It is roughly 2.5 times more. Poles that were engineered to a certain design standard, even upgraded poles, are facing loads their specifications did not contemplate. They come down, and when they come down across an island system with no grid interconnection to the outside world, there is no neighbouring utility to reroute power from. The lights go out everywhere all at once and they stay out. The grid failure cascades to water systems within hours. This is the sequence that turns a power outage into a survival problem. Electrically powered pumping stations move water through distribution networks on these islands. No power means no pump pressure. No pump pressure means no running water in homes, no pressure for fire suppression systems, no water for hospital sterilisation. The cascade does not stop there. Communications infrastructure, dependent on the same grid and on generator fuel with a finite supply, begins degrading within the first 24 hours. Battery backups run down. Generators consume their fuel reserves. The voices go quiet one by one, and the picture of what is happening across the island chain starts going dark just as the need for situational awareness becomes most acute. Transportation networks are blocked by debris, flooding, and in some areas the physical destruction of road sections. Port operations at the harbour facilities across the CNMEI cease entirely, and may not resume for 1 to 3 weeks depending on the severity of harbour infrastructure damage. The islands do not just lose power, they lose the ability to tell anyone how bad it is, and they lose the ability to receive the resources that would begin fixing it. To understand the scale of what this baseline scenario represents in economic terms, you can use Typhoon Mawar from 2023 as a calibration point. Mawar caused somewhere in the range of $1 to $2 billion in damage across Guam despite not making a direct eyewall strike. It grazed, It did not land, and it still produced billion-dollar damage figures. Sinlaku, at current intensity and with a more direct track into the CNMI, is operating in a damage class that could easily exceed Maua's toll by a substantial multiple. Direct economic damage to infrastructure alone, before you count business interruption, recovery costs, temporary housing requirements, or the long-tail costs of extended displacement, puts this scenario into multi-billion-dollar territory with significant upside risk to that estimate. And economic damage figures, as useful as they are for understanding scale, do not capture the dimension of this that resists quantification. The months of disrupted medical care, the displacement of families from homes that no longer exist, the slow economic bleed of a regional economy that cannot function without the infrastructure Sinlaku is about to remove. This is the baseline, the 60 to 80% outcome, the version of events that is already, by any reasonable standard, a major disaster requiring sustained federal engagement over months. And it does not require any unusual secondary events, any geological surprises, any military complication, or any logistics failure beyond what we already know the geography guarantees. It requires only that Sinlaku perform approximately as its current intensity and track predict. No escalation, no compounding, no black swan. Just the storm doing what the storm is already doing, arriving where it is already heading, and delivering what 180 miles per hour of organised atmospheric violence delivers when it meets an isolated island chain 6,000 miles from meaningful outside help. If you're an emergency planner in Washington right now, the baseline catastrophe is not the scenario that keeps you awake. It is the starting point. It is the outcome you have already accepted as probable and begun planning for. The scenarios above it on the probability ladder, the ones that require something additional to go wrong or something additional to arrive at the wrong moment, are where the real sleeplessness begins, and that is exactly where we are going next. Part 8. Guam Direct Hit Escalation. The next rung on the ladder accounts for a track that brings Sinlaku's eye wall directly over Guam, rather than threading primarily through the CNMI. Current probability estimates for this outcome range from roughly 15 to 30%, meaningfully lower than the baseline CNMI strike, but far from negligible, and the consequences of this particular outcome are different in kind, not just in degree. 15 to 30% is not a remote possibility. It is not a footnote. If you told anyone in any other context that there was a 15 to 30% chance of a historically catastrophic event occurring in the next 24 hours, they would not sleep. They would not go to work. They would be doing something about it. The only reason that number feels manageable is that we have normalized the language of probability in disaster forecasting to the point where anything below 50% sounds unlikely. It is not unlikely. It is a coin flip with worse odds, and the coin is 180 miles per hour. Guam is not simply a larger version of Saipan. This is the central fact that separates this rung of the ladder from the one below it, and it cannot be overstated. Guam is the hub. It is the logistics center, the communications anchor, the medical referral destination, the military staging platform, and the administrative core of the entire American presence in the Western Pacific. Every other island in this chain depends on Guam functioning. When Saipan loses power, Guam coordinates the response. When the CNMI needs medical evacuation, patients go to Guam. When federal disaster relief needs a staging point in the region, it flows through Guam. The island is not just a place where people live. It is the load-bearing structure underneath everything else. And when the hub fails, the entire network it connects fails with it, not because those other islands were additionally damaged, but because the system that was supposed to support them no longer exists. Wind exposure over Guam in an eye-wall passage scenario means sustained winds potentially near the 180 miles per hour, current peak intensity of the storm, since Guam is only approximately 120 miles southwest of Rota, and the storm tracking northwest could straddle both. 180 miles per hour over Guam is not the same event as 180 miles per hour over Saipan, even though the wind speed is identical. The difference is what is underneath those winds. Guam has a surface area roughly 3 times larger than Saipan. It has a population roughly 3 times larger. It has a hospital network, a telecommunications infrastructure, a power generation system, and a commercial and military installation density that dwarfs anything else in the Marianas chain. More infrastructure under the same wind loading means more total damage. More critical systems exposed to the same failure thresholds means more simultaneous cascade triggers. The structural consequence of that wind level over a more densely developed island is not simply more damage. It is the removal of the Recovery Coordination Centre at the precise moment the recovery needs coordinating. When Guam's infrastructure fails, the entity that was supposed to coordinate CNMI recovery is itself in need of coordination. Sit with that for a moment, because the logical structure of it is important. The baseline scenario we just walked through, the 60 to 80% outcome, assumed that Guam was functional. It assumed that Guam's hospitals could receive evacuees. It assumed that Guam's port could begin staging resupply operations for the CNMI within days of the storm passing. It assumed that Guam's communications infrastructure remained intact enough to serve as the regional coordination node. The Guam direct hit scenario removes every one of those assumptions simultaneously. The backstop is gone, the coordinator needs a coordinator, and there is nothing behind Guam in the regional architecture to absorb that load, because Guam was always supposed to be the last line of defence, not a casualty. Apra Harbour's operational shutdown under a direct Guam hit deserves specific attention because it is the logistical keystone of the entire regional recovery operation. The harbour is not simply the place where civilian goods arrive on weekly shipping cycles, it is the fuel terminal that supplies the power generation infrastructure across the region. It is the military supply node that keeps forward-deployed naval forces operational at distance from the continental United States. It is the staging point for post-disaster resupply missions, the only facility in the Marianas chain with the pier depth and crane capacity to handle large cargo vessels and naval ships simultaneously. There is no backup deepwater port in this island chain. There is no secondary facility that steps in when APRA is non-functional. APRA is it. And if storm surge in the 15 to 25 foot range, consistent with what Sinlaku is capable of generating, reaches the harbour infrastructure, the damage to pier structures, fuel handling equipment, and navigation aids could extend the operational closure from days to weeks. During those weeks, the supply chain into the entire Marianas region operates exclusively through airlift, and airlift, for all of its speed and flexibility, cannot carry fuel drums, construction equipment, bulk food supplies, or the heavy machinery that disaster recovery at this scale requires. It fills gaps. It cannot replace maritime shipping volume. The math does not work. For historical context on what a major Guam strike means, you can look at Super Typhoon Karen in 1962, which struck Guam as a Category 4 equivalent and caused damage that at the time required one of the largest peacetime reconstruction efforts the United States had undertaken in the Pacific since the end of World War II. Entire neighbourhoods were destroyed. The reconstruction effort took years and required sustained federal investment that dwarfed the initial damage estimates. And Karen, for all of its historical significance, was a Category 4 in 1962, striking an island that was a fraction of its current infrastructure complexity. The critical difference between 1962 and today is not just the storm intensity, though Sinlaku exceeds Karen in that department. It is the density and interdependency of what now exists on Guam. The hospital network is larger and more dependent on technology, on powered equipment, on refrigerated medications, on electronically managed patient monitoring systems that cease functioning the moment grid power disappears. The military installations are more capable, but also more infrastructure dependent, requiring specialized fuel handling, precision navigation systems, and hardened communications that cannot be improvised or jury-rigged after catastrophic damage. The civilian telecommunications, fuel and water systems now serve a larger, more infrastructure-reliant population that has no meaningful capacity to revert to pre-modern survival conditions for an extended period. A storm of Karen's strength in 1962 produced one outcome. A storm of Sinlaku's strength in 2025 against a more complex, more densely interconnected, more technology-dependent infrastructure environment produces something categorically different, and the cascade failure dynamics we have been building throughout this analysis apply with full force to every one of those added layers. The strategic implication of a Guam direct hit extends beyond the humanitarian emergency into territory that defense analysts and Pacific Command planners are watching, with a level of attention that does not make it into weather coverage. Andersen Air Force Base sits on the northern end of Guam. Its runways support B-52 and B-2 bomber operations across the western Pacific and Indian Ocean. If those runways are damaged, and runway surface damage from debris impact, flooding, and infrastructure failure adjacent to the airfield is a realistic outcome under eyewall conditions, The repair timeline requires specialised equipment and expertise that is not on the island and cannot be rapidly delivered through a disrupted logistics environment. The window of degraded operational capability is not hours, it is days to weeks. Naval Base Guam's pier infrastructure, if struck by surge in excess of design parameters, may restrict the class of vessels that can use the facility until structural assessments are completed and repairs are made. The combination of a regional humanitarian emergency requiring massive logistical support flowing in and a simultaneous degradation of the primary military logistics hub that those supplies need to flow through creates a coordination challenge without a clean parallel in modern American disaster response history. You're trying to use a damaged tool to fix the damage the tool itself sustained. The circularity of that problem does not resolve cleanly, and the timeline it creates is longer and more operationally consequential than any single system failure would be on its own. And that challenge, the Guam direct hit, the hub failure, the logistical keystone pulled from the arch, is still just the second rung on the probability ladder. The scenarios above it require something more than a direct hit on the most important island in the chain. They require that more than one thing go catastrophically wrong at the same time. Which brings us to the rung that emergency planners classify not as a severe outcome, but as a worst-case compound event, and the specific mechanism by which it becomes something that has no modern precedent in American territorial disaster history. Part 9. Dual Island Failure Scenario. At the outer edge of realistic probability, somewhere in the range of 1 to 5%, sits a scenario that emergency planners classify as a worst-case compound event. Simultaneous major infrastructure failure across both the CNMI and Guam, occurring close enough in time that the recovery apparatus for each territory is overwhelmed simultaneously rather than sequentially. This is the scenario where the 120 miles separating the two island systems stops being a comfortable buffer and becomes an organisational nightmare. 1 to 5%. That is the number that gets this scenario filed in the back of the drawer rather than the front. It is the number that means most tabletop exercises spend 40 minutes on the baseline and 5 minutes on this. But 1 to 5% of an event with consequences at this scale is not a number you dismiss. It is a number you build contingency plans for quietly and hope you never have to open. To understand why this scenario is qualitatively different from the ones below it on the ladder, you have to understand what the 120 miles between Guam and the CNMI actually represents in operational terms. Under the baseline scenario, that distance is a feature. It is the gap that keeps Guam functional, while the CNMI absorbs the worst of the storm. It is the reason Guam's hospitals can receive CNMI evacuees, why Guam's port can begin staging recovery supplies, why Guam's communications infrastructure can serve as the regional coordination node while the CNMI rebuilds. 120 miles of ocean is not much in most contexts. In the context of disaster response architecture, it is everything. It is the difference between a regional emergency with a functioning coordination centre and a regional emergency with no coordination centre at all. The dual island failure scenario does not just remove that buffer, it weaponises the distance, turning the gap between the two island systems from a protective feature into a logistical obstacle that compounds every other problem the response faces. The mechanism is straightforward even if the probability is low. A storm with a broad wind field and a track that threads between Guam and the CNMI, rather than clearly choosing one or the other, can deliver devastating impacts to both simultaneously. Sinlaku's current wind field is wide enough that this geometry is physically possible. The storm does not have to be perfectly centred between the two island systems to produce this outcome. It only has to be wide enough and positioned closely enough to both that the wind gradient delivers catastrophic loading to the CNMI's core infrastructure at the same time it delivers sufficient loading to collapse Guam's power grid and disable its port. In that scenario, the CNMI experiences eye-wall conditions. The full 160 to 180 miles per hour envelope we have already described in detail, while Guam simultaneously experiences severe outer eye wall or intense rainband conditions. Those conditions do not need to match the eye wall intensity to produce cascade failure on Guam. The Guam grid, the harbour and the airfield do not require a direct eye wall hit to fail. They require sustained wind loading above their design thresholds, storm surge above their flood protection parameters, and rainfall accumulation sufficient to saturate drainage systems and trigger infrastructure flooding. All of that is achievable from the outer wind field of a storm the size and intensity of Sinlaku. The eyewall does not need to cross Guam, it only needs to pass close enough. Split FEMA response logistics across two simultaneous disaster declarations separated by 120 miles of ocean is not an operation that the agency has a well-rehearsed playbook for, because nothing quite like it has happened in the modern era of American territorial disaster response. This is worth sitting with, because the federal disaster response system is, in many ways, a genuinely impressive machine. It has learned from Katrina, it has adapted after Maria, it has developed pre-positioning strategies and logistics frameworks and interagency coordination protocols that represent decades of institutional learning. But that machine was built around a set of assumptions about how disasters occur and how response resources flow toward them. The central assumption is directionality. Disaster happens somewhere, resources flow from somewhere else toward it, and the somewhere else remains functional enough to serve as the origin point for that flow. The dual island failure scenario breaks that assumption completely. There is no functional origin point in the region. There is no island in the Marianas chain that is simultaneously close enough to matter and undamaged enough to serve as a staging base. The coordinator for CNMI recovery would normally be Guam. The coordinator for Pacific-wide logistics would normally be infrastructure on Guam. If both are simultaneously non-functional, the coordination structure for the entire regional response has to be rebuilt from outside the region entirely, from Hawaii, 2,500 miles away, or from the mainland 6,000 miles away, with all of the communication delays, situational awareness gaps, and decision latency that distance implies. A communications blackout across the entire Mariana chain under this scenario is not a hypothetical. It is a direct and predictable consequence of the cascade failure model applied simultaneously to two island systems that share the same infrastructure dependency patterns. Both territories run on overhead power lines that fail under Category 4 to 5 wind loading. Both territories depend on electrically powered communications infrastructure with generator backup systems rated for 72 to 96 hours. Both territories receive their fuel through Apra Harbour, which is non-functional in this scenario. The cascade does not behave differently on Guam than it does on Saipan just because Guam is larger and more developed. It behaves the same way, on the same timeline, producing the same progressive darkening of the information picture, except now it is happening across the entire island chain at once, and the entity that would normally be watching that picture go dark and coordinating the response is itself going dark at the same time. Medical systems on both Guam and in the CNMI would be strained toward and potentially past capacity simultaneously. This is where the human cost of the dual island scenario becomes most concrete and most difficult to look at directly. Guam's Guam Memorial Hospital and the military medical facilities at Naval Base Guam are the tertiary care referral destinations for the entire Marianas region. When a patient on Saipan needs care beyond what the CNMI Health Center can provide, they go to Guam. When a patient on Rota needs emergency surgery, they go to Guam. Under the baseline scenario, that referral pathway remains open, damaged, strained, operating under emergency conditions, but open. Under the dual island failure scenario, it closes. Guam's medical facilities are managing their own mass casualty event. The referral destination is a casualty. Medical evacuation is impossible during the immediate storm window and severely limited in the days following due to airfield conditions and aircraft availability. The patients who need more care than the local facilities can provide are on islands where the local facilities are simultaneously overwhelmed, undersupplied, and operating on generator power that is counting down toward depletion. The triage decisions that get made in that environment are not the decisions anyone designed the system to make. Fuel shortages begin developing on both territories simultaneously, competing for the same limited resupply capacity that can flow through whatever logistics channels remain functional. The arithmetic here is unforgiving. Two island systems, each drawing down generator fuel reserves at the rate their critical facilities consume it, each unable to receive maritime resupply through a closed harbour, each dependent on airlift that is capacity constrained and weather dependent in the days immediately following a major typhoon. The fuel that exists on the islands at landfall is the fuel that has to last until the harbour reopens, or until airlift can begin delivering meaningful quantities of petroleum. And meaningful quantities of petroleum in the context of running hospital generators, emergency operations centres, water pumping systems, and military backup power across 2 territories simultaneously is a volume that airlift cannot realistically deliver. The gap between what exists and what is needed grows every hour on both islands at the same time, with no mechanism to close it from within the region. The specific reason the dual island scenario sits at such a concerning position in this story, why it is worth spending this time on a 1 to 5% probability, connects directly back to the central reality that Sinlaku is forcing into view. These islands cannot fail partially. The infrastructure is too tightly coupled, the geographic isolation is too severe, and the external resupply chain is too distant and too slow to compensate for the loss of internal redundancy. There is no graceful degradation mode available to an island system this isolated. There is no neighbouring grid to draw power from. There is no overland route for supplies to arrive on. There is no partial failure state where some of the critical systems keep running while the damaged ones are repaired. When one island system fails, the other is supposed to carry the load. That is the design. That is the redundancy the architecture was built around. When both fail at the same time, there is no load-bearing structure left in the region. That is not a dramatic framing for effect. That is what zero internal redundancy means in a real-world system under real-world stress. Not a metaphor, not an abstraction, but a specific operational condition with specific human consequences that begin accumulating the moment the cascade completes on both islands simultaneously. And the next category of risk, the scenarios that carry even lower probability, but consequences that operate at a scale beyond anything the modern American disaster response framework was designed to handle, takes that zero redundancy reality and asks a specific and deeply uncomfortable question. What happens when something else arrives into it at the same time? Part 10. Earthquake and typhoon overlap risk. Low probability, high consequence. Non-linear interaction effects. These are the 3 characteristics that define what risk analysts call black swan events, scenarios that sit far enough from the centre of the probability distribution that planning resources rarely reach them, but whose consequences, if they occur, operate at a scale that no conventional response framework was designed to handle. The term black swan gets used loosely in a lot of contexts, applied to things that were merely surprising rather than genuinely outside the boundary of conventional planning. What we're talking about here is not that. What we're talking about is a scenario where 2 independent physical systems, each operating on its own timescale and driven by its own forces, arrive in the same geography at the same moment, and where the combination of the 2 produces outcomes that neither system would have produced alone, outcomes that no single hazard planning framework anticipated, and outcomes that the response architecture was not built to handle, because it was never designed around the possibility that both systems would activate simultaneously. In the Marianas right now, with Sinlaku hours from landfall, and a magnitude 4.5 earthquake already on the seismic record for this week, the black swan worth spending the most time on is the compound typhoon earthquake scenario, not because it is likely, but because of what it does to everything we have already discussed. Everything. The cascade failure model, the generator depletion timeline, the communications blackout, the medical system strain, the port closure. All of it gets fed into a nonlinear amplifier when a significant seismic event arrives into the same window, and what comes out the other side is not a worse version of the scenarios we have already described, it is a different category of event entirely. Let's start with the geology, because it matters more here than in almost any other storm scenario you could construct anywhere on Earth. The Mariana Trench subduction zone is not background scenery. It is one of the most seismically active convergence boundaries on the surface of the planet. The Pacific Plate, moving roughly toward the Philippines at a rate of several centimeters per year, is being driven underneath the Mariana Plate in a process that has been ongoing for millions of years and that shows no sign of stopping. The same subduction process that carved the deepest point on the ocean floor, more than 36,000 feet below sea level at its maximum, is also the engine that created the Mariana Islands themselves. These islands are the visible surface expression of volcanic and tectonic activity that has been building and releasing stress in this region across geological time. They are not sitting on stable continental shelf. They are sitting on the tips of enormous underwater volcanoes perched above one of the most energetic tectonic boundaries on Earth. The ground underneath Sinlaku's target zone is not passive. It has its own agenda, operating on its own schedule, and that schedule does not pause for typhoon season. A magnitude 7.0 or larger in the Mariana region occurs on a timescale of years to decades, not an imminent daily risk, but also not an exotic geological fantasy. This is an important distinction to make carefully, because the goal here is not to alarm people with implausible scenarios dressed up in scientific language. Historical seismic catalogues for the Western Pacific document major events in this region at a recurrence interval that makes a decade a reasonable planning window. The specific timing of such an event during a typhoon remains unlikely in any given storm window. The probability of a major earthquake occurring specifically during the hours or days that Sinlaku is in the impact zone is genuinely low. But unlikely and impossible are not the same word. They are not even close to the same word. And the magnitude 4.5 that registered near Guam this week, and the magnitude 5.0 near Pagan in the northern Marianas around the same time, are reminders that the subduction zone is not dormant. It is active. It is producing events. And the recurrent statistics for major events in this region exist not as theoretical calculations, but as documented history written in seismic catalogues that go back centuries. The structural interaction between typhoon wind loading and seismic ground motion is where things get genuinely alarming, and where the nonlinear amplification effect becomes most concrete. Consider a building that has just experienced 6 to 12 hours of sustained wind loading at 150 to 180 miles per hour. Not a building that has been destroyed, a building that has survived, a building that is still standing when the wind finally drops, that will be counted in the post-storm assessment as part of the surviving stock rather than the loss column. That building has not emerged from the typhoon in the same condition it entered it. It has experienced thousands of stress cycles in its connections, its fasteners, its foundation anchors, and its structural frame. Every gust that loaded the roof upward and then released it cycled the fasteners holding that roof to the wall framing. Every sustained wind load that pushed laterally against the walls cycled the anchor bolts connecting the wall to the foundation. Engineers call this fatigue loading, and the concept is precise. A bolt, a weld, a connection plate. All of these are rated for a certain number of loading cycles before the accumulated microscopic damage in the material reaches the threshold of failure. A building that has just survived a Category 5 typhoon has not emerged unscathed. It has spent some of those cycles. How many depends on the specific intensity, duration, and gustiness of the wind it experienced. But the reserve capacity that was present at the beginning of the storm is not fully present at the end of it. The structure is weaker than it was, and into that already fatigued structure, a magnitude 7 ground motion arrives. The building's response to the seismic load is not the response of a fresh, unloaded structure. It is the response of a structure that has already consumed some fraction of its designed capacity, whose connections have been cycled toward their fatigue limits, and whose foundation anchors have been repeatedly stressed in directions they may not have been primarily designed to resist. The seismic load arrives and finds a structure that has less to give than its original design specifications suggest. The failure threshold that seemed safely distant at the beginning of the storm is now closer. Some structures that would have survived the earthquake alone, having already survived the typhoon alone, do not survive the combination. And the population sheltering inside those structures, sheltering because there was nowhere else to go, because the evacuation was impossible, because the instructions were to find the strongest available structure and stay in it, is inside buildings whose reserve capacity has been quietly consumed by the hours of wind loading that came before. Ground saturation compounds this interaction significantly, and in ways that extend beyond individual structures to the landscape itself. Extreme typhoon rainfall, the 6 to 12 inches across the primary impact zone, with localized bursts substantially higher in upslope areas, saturates island soils to a degree that dramatically reduces their shear strength. Shear strength is the property of soil that allows it to resist lateral movement, to hold slopes in place, to provide stable bearing for foundations. When soil is saturated, the water filling the pore spaces between soil particles reduces the friction that gives the soil its strength. Slopes that were stable under dry conditions become marginal under saturated conditions. Foundations that were providing reliable bearing become less predictable. And in some geological configurations, particularly in volcanic soils with specific grain size distributions, which are precisely the soils found on islands like those in the Marianas, saturated ground under seismic loading becomes susceptible to a process called liquefaction. Liquefaction is not a metaphor. It is a specific physical process in which the structure of the soil temporarily collapses under the vibration of seismic waves, and the ground briefly behaves more like a liquid than a solid. Buildings sink, slopes flow, infrastructure that was founded on ground that seemed solid finds itself on ground that is no longer providing the support the engineering assumed. The Philippine Islands, which share many geological and meteorological characteristics with the Marianas, volcanic soils, high seismicity, typhoon exposure, have documented this exact combination multiple times. Earthquake-triggered landslides into soils saturated by typhoon rainfall. Compound events that produced outcomes no single hazard assessment predicted, that caused damage in locations that neither the typhoon model nor the earthquake model identified as high risk, because neither model was running the other model's output as its initial condition. The failures happened in the gap between the hazard assessments. They happened precisely because the planning framework treated the two systems as independent, when the physical reality treated them as sequential loads on the same material. The scientific community maintains appropriate caution about drawing direct causal links between atmospheric pressure changes from typhoons and seismic triggering, and that caution is well-founded and important to state clearly. The correlation versus coincidence debate in compound hazard research is ongoing and unresolved. There is no established mechanism by which the pressure changes associated with a typhoon reliably trigger seismic events at depth, and claiming otherwise would misrepresent the current state of the science. But the point of this analysis is not whether Sinlaku causes an earthquake. The point is something more precise and more actionable than that. The point is what happens to island infrastructure that is already at the outer edge of its designed capacity, already running on degraded structural reserves, already operating on generator fuel that is counting down, already disconnected from external resupply by a closed port, already managing a communications blackout that is getting darker by the hour, if a significant seismic event arrives into that condition during or immediately after the storm window. The answer, played through the cascade failure model we have spent this entire analysis building up, is that the non-linear amplification of damage could push outcomes from the catastrophic into territory that has no modern precedent in the United States disaster record. Not a worse version of what we have already described, a different kind of event. One where the structures that survived the wind fail under the shaking. One where the slopes that held through the rainfall fail under the seismic loading. One where the cascade that was already running at maximum speed receives an additional trigger at the moment the response system has the least capacity to absorb it. The earthquake does not have to be the main event. It does not have to be the headline. It only has to arrive at the right moment in the cascade sequence, after the wind has spent the structural reserves, after the rain has saturated the ground, after the generators have been running for 36 hours, and the fuel gauges are moving toward empty. At that moment, even a moderate seismic event is not arriving into a resilient system. It is arriving into a system that has already given most of what it had, and what happens next is not something any single hazard planning framework was designed to tell you. Part 11. Tsunami Compression Effect. The Mariana Trench subduction zone that produces the earthquake risk also produces, under specific rupture geometries and magnitudes, the potential for tsunami generation in the Western Pacific. This is a passing reference in the worst-case taxonomy. The probability of a significant locally generated tsunami during the Sinlaku window is very low, and stating that clearly matters, because this section of the analysis is not about manufacturing fear from remote possibilities. It is about understanding the complete hazard architecture of the geography Sinlaku is entering, and about recognizing that the infrastructure gaps we have already documented do not become less dangerous when the probability of an additional hazard is low. They become more dangerous, because every gap in the warning system, every degraded communication node, every generator running toward empty, is a gap that applies equally to every hazard that arrives in the same window, regardless of how probable or improbable that hazard was on its own. To understand the tsunami risk in this context, you have to understand how tsunamis are generated and why the Mariana subduction zone is a credible source. Tsunamis are not caused by all earthquakes. They are caused specifically by earthquakes that produce significant vertical displacement of the ocean floor, events where one plate suddenly moves up or down relative to another, displacing the water column above it and generating a wave that propagates outward from the rupture zone at speeds that can exceed 500 miles per hour in open ocean. Subduction zone earthquakes, where one tectonic plate is being driven underneath another, are the most efficient generators of this kind of vertical displacement. The Mariana Trench subduction zone, where the Pacific Plate descends beneath the Mariana Plate, is exactly the geometry that produces tsunami-genic earthquakes. It has done so before. The historical and geological record for the Western Pacific documents tsunami events sourced from this region, and the recurrent statistics for large subduction zone ruptures in the Marianas are not zero. They are low, but they are not zero. The critical variable in whether a subduction zone earthquake generates a significant tsunami is the rupture geometry, specifically, whether the fault movement has a large vertical component, how much of the fault surface ruptures, and how close to the surface that rupture occurs. Deep slab events, like the magnitude 4.5 that registered near Guam this week, at approximately 100 kilometers depth, are generally poor tsunami generators because the vertical displacement they produce is attenuated by the distance between the rupture and the ocean floor. Shallow interface events, ruptures occurring at the boundary between the two plates at shallower depths, are the dangerous ones. A magnitude 7.5 or larger shallow interface rupture in the Mariana region could generate a locally significant tsunami, with arrival times at the nearest islands, measured not in hours, but in minutes. 10 to 15 minutes from rupture to first wave arrival at some coastal locations. That number is the one that connects the tsunami risk directly to the Sinlaku scenario in the most operationally consequential way. Guam and the CNMI sit surrounded by fringing reefs and complex coastal geometries that interact with incoming wave energy in ways that make simple open ocean arrival calculations unreliable guides to what actually reaches the shoreline. The reefs do both things simultaneously. They dissipate some of the incoming wave energy through friction as the wave moves across the shallow reef platform, and they focus and amplify the rest through channeling effects as the wave wraps around coastal features and enters bays and harbours. The net result is a highly variable coastal inundation pattern where locations separated by a few hundred meters can experience dramatically different wave heights. A bay that opens toward the direction of tsunami propagation acts as a funnel, compressing the wave energy laterally as the bay narrows, and converting that lateral compression into vertical amplification of wave height. Apra Harbour on Guam, with its specific orientation and geometry, is exactly the kind of coastal feature that tsunami modelling treats with particular attention, because harbours and bays consistently produce higher local run-up heights than open coastline locations exposed to the same offshore wave. The harbour that is already non-functional due to typhoon damage does not become less dangerous because it is already damaged. This surge that fills it during a concurrent tsunami event fills a space that may already have compromised infrastructure along its margins, and the combination of storm surge water levels and tsunami wave arrival produces inundation that neither event would have produced reaching those elevations alone. The physical interaction between an existing elevated storm surge and an incoming tsunami wave is the technical detail that most people do not know, and that most disaster coverage does not explain, because it requires engaging with nonlinear hydraulics in a way that resists simple summary. Here is the simplest accurate version. Storm surge raises the baseline water level along the coast. On a normal day, the shoreline is at sea level, and any incoming wave, including a tsunami wave, interacts with that baseline. The tsunami's run-up height is calculated relative to normal sea level conditions, but during a typhoon, the baseline is not at sea level. Storm surge of 15 to 25 feet means the water surface along the coast is already 15 to 25 feet above normal. A tsunami wave arriving into that elevated baseline does not start from sea level. It starts from the surge level and adds its own height on top of it. The interaction is not perfectly additive. The hydraulics are more complex than simple addition, but the outcome is coastal inundation that can reach elevations significantly higher than either the storm surge alone or the tsunami alone would have produced. Structures that were designed to withstand a 100-year storm surge were not designed for a 100-year storm surge, plus a concurrent tsunami wave. The engineering margins that seemed adequate for one event are not adequate for the superposition of two. The specific complication in a typhoon concurrent scenario is the warning system, and this is where the low probability nature of the event stops providing comfort. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center maintains continuous seismic monitoring across the Pacific Basin and has the capability to issue tsunami warnings within minutes of detecting a qualifying earthquake. Under normal operating conditions, that warning reaches coastal populations through sirens, emergency alert systems, television and radio broadcasts, and mobile phone notifications, a redundant multi-channel communication architecture designed specifically to reach people who might not be monitoring any single channel at the moment of the alert. That architecture assumes the communication channels are functional. It assumes the sirens have power. It assumes the cellular network is operational. It assumes the television and radio broadcast infrastructure is transmitting. Under conditions where Sinlaku has already collapsed the power grid, degraded the cellular infrastructure, taken broadcast towers offline, and committed every emergency management resource to active storm response, that multi-channel warning architecture has been reduced to whatever fraction of its components remain functional after the cascade failure. A 10 to 15 minute warning window, already compressed under ideal conditions, already shorter than the time required for meaningful evacuation of coastal areas, becomes a warning window measured in whatever the degraded communication system can actually deliver to a population that is sheltering in place, that has no vehicles available due to flooding and debris, that has no elevated ground to move to within the available time, and whose emergency management apparatus is already fully committed to a concurrent mass casualty event. This is the warning problem in its starkest form. The warning system was designed for the hazard in isolation. Every component of its redundancy depends on infrastructure that Sinlaku has already degraded or destroyed. The population receiving the warning has no meaningful ability to act on it within the available time under storm conditions, and the emergency managers who would normally coordinate the response to a tsunami warning are simultaneously managing the largest storm disaster in the modern history of their territory. The warning does not fail because of negligence or poor design. It fails because the infrastructure gaps that Sinlaku creates are the same gaps the warning system depends on, and a system cannot warn through gaps it has fallen into. The nonlinear hydraulics of the surge tsunami interaction, the compressed warning window, the degraded communication architecture, the population with no evacuation options under storm conditions, none of this changes the probability assessment, which remains very low for the specific combination of a locally generated significant tsunami arriving during the active Sinlaku window. That probability is genuinely low and should be stated as such. But probability and consequence operate on different axes, and the consequence axis for this scenario reaches elevations that no other single component of this analysis reaches alone. The tsunami does not have to be large to be catastrophic in this context. It only has to arrive when the baseline water level is already elevated by storm surge, when the warning system is operating at degraded capacity, when the population has no ability to move, and when the emergency response apparatus has no remaining capacity to absorb an additional simultaneous event. Under those conditions, a moderate locally generated tsunami is not a moderate event. It is an extreme event delivered into a system that has no defences left to offer it. What the tsunami scenario ultimately connects back to, the reason it belongs in this analysis despite its low probability, is the central observation that has been running underneath every section of this story. Sinlaku is not simply a storm threatening an island. It is a stress event arriving into a geographic zone that carries multiple independent hazard potentials simultaneously. And the infrastructure gaps we have documented throughout this analysis, the communications fragility, the evacuation impossibility, the generator fuel limitations, the port dependency, the zero internal redundancy, are the same gaps that make every additional hazard within the storm window harder to manage than it would be in a more resilient operating environment. The gaps do not belong to Sinlaku alone, they belong to the geography. They were there before Sinlaku formed, they will be there after Sinlaku passes, and they apply with equal indifference to every hazard that arrives into them, regardless of how that hazard was rated on the probability scale before it arrived. Part 12. Infrastructure Cascade Collapse. Let's revisit the cascade model one more time and take it to its logical conclusion, because the black swan version of infrastructure failure is not about more wind or more rain. It is not about a stronger storm, or a higher surge, or a longer rainfall accumulation. Those variables matter enormously in the earlier scenarios on the probability ladder, but by the time you reach the black swan tier of this analysis, the physical parameters of the storm itself are almost secondary. What matters at this level is timing. Specifically, the gap between when things fail and when outside help can arrive to arrest the cascade before it reaches the threshold that separates a disaster from something that does not have a clean name in the emergency management lexicon. a condition where the systems a modern population depends on for physical survival are simultaneously non-functional. The external resupply chain cannot reach them at scale, and the internal resources available to bridge that gap are running out in real time. System theorists use a concept called tight coupling to describe infrastructure arrangements where one component's failure rapidly and automatically propagates to adjacent components with little or no buffer time for human intervention. The term comes from organizational accident research, from the study of why complex systems sometimes fail catastrophically rather than gracefully, and it describes a specific structural property that makes certain systems more dangerous than others when things go wrong. A loosely coupled system has slack in it. When one component fails, there is buffer time, alternative pathways, redundant capacity that absorbs the shock while the failed component is repaired or replaced. A tightly coupled system has none of that. When one component fails, the next component in the chain begins failing almost immediately, not because of any additional external force, but because it was depending on the first component to function. The failure propagates automatically, rapidly, and with very little opportunity for intervention between steps. Island infrastructure systems are among the most tightly coupled in the world, and the reason is the same reason they are so difficult to make resilient: isolation. On a continent, or even on a large island with connections to neighbouring land masses, infrastructure systems can be loosely coupled because there are external systems available to absorb the shock when internal components fail. A power outage in one region can be partially compensated by drawing from neighbouring regions. A water system failure can be partially addressed by trucking water from outside the affected area. A fuel shortage can be relieved by rerouting supply chains through alternative distribution networks. None of those compensation mechanisms exist in the Marianas. There are no neighbouring regions to draw power from. There are no roads connecting these islands to anywhere. There is one port and one airport on each island, and when those fail, the external world's ability to provide compensation drops to near zero. The isolation that defines the geography also defines the coupling. Every critical system depends on every other critical system, with no external buffer, no neighbouring network, no alternative pathway. Remove the first link in the chain, and the whole chain begins moving, automatically, rapidly, with the clock running from the moment the first failure occurs. The power, water, healthcare, fuel, communications chain we built earlier in this analysis is the purest example of tight coupling in a disaster context, and it is worth walking through the timing one more time with the black swan lens applied. Power fails within hours of eyewall passage, the statistical expectation, not the worst case. Water pressure drops within hours of power failure because the pumping stations have no power and no meaningful battery backup. Healthcare facilities switch to generator power within the same window, beginning the fuel consumption clock that defines the survival timeline for their most vulnerable patients. Communications infrastructure begins degrading as battery backups run down, and generator fuel begins depleting at communications towers across the island chain. Transportation networks are blocked by debris and flooding, preventing the internal redistribution of whatever fuel reserves exist in different locations across the islands. Each of these failures happens on its own timeline, measured in hours, and each one removes a capability that the next system in the chain was depending on. The cascade does not announce itself. It proceeds quietly, systemically, in a sequence that can look like a series of separate manageable problems right up until the moment it becomes a single unmanageable one. Generator dependency is the specific timing mechanism that turns a disruption into a crisis, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in typhoon coverage because it is the clock that everything else runs against. Most critical facilities, hospitals, emergency operations centres, communications nodes, water pumping stations equipped with backup power, maintain generator fuel reserves for somewhere between 72 and 96 hours of operation under full load. This is the design standard for emergency backup power in the United States, and it is a reasonable standard for the vast majority of disaster scenarios that these facilities were designed to handle. 72 to 96 hours covers the period of a typical mainland disaster response, the window between when a hurricane or earthquake strikes and when external resupply begins arriving at meaningful scale. The standard was set for a context where mutual aid from neighbouring states can arrive within hours, where the National Guard can be on site within a day, where federal logistics can begin flowing within 48 hours. It was set for a context where the geography cooperates with the response timeline. In the Marianas, the geography does not cooperate. Port damage from a direct Category 5 strike potentially extending harbour operations closure to 2 to 3 weeks is not a pessimistic assumption. It is consistent with documented historical experience from comparable events across the Pacific. During those 2 to 3 weeks, the supply chain into the islands operates through airlift alone, and airlift, for all of its speed, cannot deliver the volume of fuel that critical facilities across 2 island territories consume when running continuously on generator power. The math is straightforward and unforgiving. The generator window closes. The critical systems it was powering enter what planners sometimes call autonomy mode, a condition where facilities are attempting to sustain themselves on whatever internal resources remain, rationing consumption, prioritizing the most critical functions, making decisions about which systems to keep running and which to shut down that no facility was designed to make and no staff was trained to implement at scale. And when the internal capacity that autonomy mode is drawing down reaches zero, the cascade reaches its final stage. Not a dramatic collapse, a quiet one. Systems going offline one by one as their fuel runs out, in an order determined by which facilities had more reserves and which had less, until the infrastructure picture of the island chain looks not like a damaged version of normal, but like something that has no modern American precedent. Prior Guam blackout cycles document this dynamic with uncomfortable specificity, and the documentation matters because it transforms the cascade model from theoretical to demonstrated. After Typhoon Pongsona struck Guam in 2002, the island experienced a power outage that lasted weeks across significant portions of the service territory. Not hours, not days, weeks. The civilian service infrastructure, water systems, fuel distribution, medical facilities, commercial operations was strained in ways that the documentation from that period captures in detail that should inform every assessment of what Sinlaku is capable of producing. Pongsona was a Category 4 equivalent. It was not Sinlaku. After Typhoon Mawar passed near Guam in 2023 without making direct eyewall landfall, temporary infrastructure degradation still demonstrated how quickly the support systems around critical facilities come under pressure when the power grid becomes unreliable. Mawar did not hit Guam directly, it passed nearby, and the documentation from Mawar already shows the early warning signs of the cascade, the generator stress, the fuel consumption acceleration, the communications degradation, the logistical strain on facilities trying to maintain normal operations in an abnormal power environment. These were not worst-case events, they were partial events. And partial events are already producing documentation that looks like the leading edge of the cascade we have been describing. The pattern that emerges from Pongsona, from Mawar, from U2 in 2018, is not a pattern of isolated incidents. It is a pattern of a system being repeatedly tested at increasing intensity levels and repeatedly showing the same structural vulnerabilities in the same sequence. Power fails, water follows, generator fuel depletes, communications degrade. The sequence is consistent because the system is consistent. The same tightly coupled architecture, the same geographic isolation, the same absence of external compensation mechanisms, tested again and again by a Western Pacific that produces major typhoons with a regularity that the planning frameworks have never fully internalized. Every time the system has been tested below the threshold of total cascade failure, it has recovered. And every recovery has been interpreted as evidence of resilience rather than as evidence of a system that has not yet been tested at the level Sinlaku is about to apply. The system fragility being exposed here is not, at its root, a storm problem. This is the conclusion that the entire cascade analysis has been building toward, and it is the one that is most uncomfortable to state plainly. It is a design problem, a structural feature of isolated island infrastructure that was built incrementally over decades, each increment optimized for the operating conditions of its era, each addition integrated into the existing architecture without a comprehensive assessment of how the whole system would behave under tail-end stress conditions. The overhead power lines were the cheapest way to string transmission infrastructure across the islands at the time they were installed. The generator backup standards were set for a response timeline that applied to continental disasters, not Pacific Island ones. The port dependency was accepted as a logistical reality rather than treated as a single-point vulnerability requiring mitigation. None of these decisions were negligent in isolation. They were reasonable responses to the conditions and constraints of the moment they were made. The problem is that the moments have accumulated into a system, and the system was never stress-tested against the events that the geography of the Western Pacific eventually guarantees will arrive. Sinlaku is not an anomaly testing a resilient system. It is not an unprecedented outlier exposing a weakness that no one could have anticipated. It is a predicted outcome, within the historical range of Western Pacific tropical cyclone activity, consistent with the intensification patterns that a warming ocean produces with increasing frequency, testing a system that was designed to function in conditions that no longer reliably describe the environment it operates in. The storm is not the failure. The storm is the test, and the question of whether the system passes or fails that test, and what the consequences of failure look like for 170,000 Americans in the hours and days and weeks that follow, is where this analysis has been pointing from the very first scenario on the probability ladder. What it all means, the design problem, the geography, the strategic implications, the question of whether any of this was ever a good idea, is where we're going next. Part 13. Total Regional Paralysis Scenario. Forget the individual failure modes for a moment. Set aside the specific wind speed numbers, the storm surge projections, the generator fuel calculations. Stop looking at the components and look at the system. Step back from the cascade diagram and look at the shape of what you see when all of those individual failure modes occur together, in the same place, in the same time window. What you see is not a disaster in the conventional sense, a thing that happens and then gets cleaned up, a damage event with a clear before and after, a crisis that peaks and then resolves along a recovery curve that eventually returns to baseline. What you see is something that does not have a clean name in the standard disaster taxonomy. What you see is total regional paralysis, a condition in which the entire infrastructure architecture of the American Marianas chain is simultaneously non-functional, the external resupply system cannot reach it at scale, and the population of 170,000 people is in a condition of genuine material survival dependency on resources that are being depleted in real time without replenishment. Not damaged, not strained, depleted. Running down towards zero with no mechanism to stop the clock. It is important to be precise about what total regional paralysis is and what it is not, because the term can sound like hyperbole, and it is not. This is not an extinction scenario. People will survive Sinlaku. The vast majority of 170,000 Americans on these islands will be alive when the storm passes, and they will be alive when federal aid eventually arrives at scale, and they will be alive to see the island chain rebuilt over the months and years that follow. None of what we're describing ends American presence in the Marianas or produces casualties on the scale of the largest historical natural disasters. The death toll from even the worst realistic Sinlaku scenario is not in the thousands or tens of thousands. The physical destruction, as catastrophic as it is the kind of destruction that has been documented, assessed and eventually repaired after previous events in this region and elsewhere. Sinlaku is not the end of these islands. It is important to say that clearly, because the analysis that follows is not about the storm killing everyone. It is about something more specific and in some ways more insidious than mass casualties from direct physical harm. Operational paralysis, the condition where the systems that a modern population depends on for water, medical care, communication and food distribution are simultaneously non-functional, is a form of crisis that produces cascading secondary harm over days and weeks that in some ways exceeds the direct physical harm from the storm itself. This is the distinction that emergency planners understand and that public communications almost never convey clearly. The storm kills people during and immediately after its passage, through wind, through surge, through flooding, through structural collapse. That is the direct harm. The operational paralysis kills people more slowly, more quietly, and in ways that are harder to see and harder to attribute, because the people who die from dialysis treatment unavailable for 2 weeks, or from surgical complications that could not be managed in a hospital running on failing generators, or from waterborne illness in a population without access to clean water for an extended period, those deaths do not look like storm deaths on a casualty report. They look like medical complications. They look like pre-existing conditions that couldn't be managed. They look like the kind of harm that happens in the space between the storm and the recovery, in the operational void that the paralysis creates. And that void, in the Marianas under the full cascade failure scenario, is not a gap measured in hours, it is a gap measured in weeks. Consider the multi-day communications blackout scenario that falls directly out of the cascade model, because it is the failure that enables and amplifies every other failure that follows it. When communications go dark across the Mariana chain, and the cascade model tells us that darkening begins within 24 hours of power failure and completes as generator fuel depletes across communications infrastructure over the following 2 to 3 days. The first thing that fails is situational awareness, not a single facility, not a single road or neighbourhood, situational awareness across the entire island chain, simultaneously, from the perspective of everyone trying to manage the response from outside the region. Emergency managers in Hawaii and on the mainland lose visibility into which hospitals are still operational and which have gone to crisis standards of care. They lose visibility into which roads are passable for debris clearance and rescue operations. They lose visibility into which communities have been cut off by flooding or structural collapse and have received no assistance. They lose visibility into where the most critical concentrations of medical need are located, which is the foundational piece of information that determines where limited airlift capacity should be directed first. Decisions made in the absence of that situational awareness are frequently the wrong decisions. They are not wrong because the decision makers are incompetent. They are wrong because the information required to make them correctly is not available. And the cost of wrong decisions in a resource-constrained post-disaster environment, where every misallocated airlift flight is a flight that did not go to the location that needed it most, is measured not in dollars or efficiency metrics, but in lives. The communications blackout is not an inconvenience for people trying to tell their families they survived. It is a direct and severe operational impairment of the rescue and recovery apparatus at the precise moment that apparatus is most needed and least able to afford impairment. Medical evacuation in the immediate aftermath of the storm is essentially impossible, and the word essentially is doing less work in that sentence than it might appear. The airfield conditions following a direct Category 5 eyewall passage are not reliable for immediate resumption of flight operations. Runway surface integrity, fuel availability at the airport, air traffic control infrastructure status and ground handling capability all have to be assessed and confirmed before regular flight operations can resume, and that assessment and confirmation process takes time that runs against the biological clocks of the patients who need evacuation most urgently. The weather window in the immediate post-storm period, with residual convection, degraded visibility, and unstable atmospheric conditions, further constrains what aircraft can safely operate and where they can safely go. The medical facilities on the receiving end, Guam, under the baseline scenario, or Hawaii under the dual island failure scenario, are themselves managing surge capacity from their own storm impact or from the volume of patients arriving from the affected islands. Every one of these constraints is real, documented in previous Pacific disaster responses, and predictable, and every one of them applies simultaneously to the patients who cannot wait for them to be resolved. Dialysis patients cannot miss treatments measured in days without experiencing life-threatening metabolic crisis. Post-surgical patients require sterile wound care, intravenous medications, and monitoring that depends on powered equipment and sterile supply chains. Patients on mechanical ventilation cannot survive the failure of the generator running their ventilator. Premature infants in neonatal intensive care units require temperature-controlled environments, specialized nutrition, and continuous monitoring that is entirely dependent on infrastructure the storm is removing. None of these patients have a biological timeline that matches the recovery timeline for the infrastructure they depend on. The recovery timeline for grid power is measured in weeks. The recovery timeline for port-dependent fuel and medical supply chains is measured in weeks. The biological timeline for many of the most vulnerable patients in these facilities is measured in hours or days. The gap between those two timelines is where the secondary mortality of operational paralysis lives, quietly, in a form that will not appear on any storm casualty count, but that will appear in the excess mortality statistics for the Marianas in the months following Sinlaku if the cascade reaches its full depth. Fuel shortages, developing over the generator depletion window and extending through the port closure period, affect not only electricity generation, but every system in the entire post-disaster operating environment that requires petroleum. Emergency vehicles running search and rescue operations consume fuel at rates that normal daily operations never approach. Backup hospital generators running continuously at full load consume fuel at rates their tank capacity was not designed to sustain for weeks. Water pumping operations running on emergency power consume fuel that was allocated for other critical systems. The logistics aircraft trying to bring initial supplies into degraded airfields consume fuel that has to come from reserves on the island because the normal resupply chain through Ypres harbour is non-functional. Everything in a modern disaster response is downstream of fuel availability, and in the Marianas the fuel system is not a distributed network with multiple supply nodes and redundant distribution pathways. It is a single pipeline that runs through one port on one island, and that port is closed. The fuel that exists on the islands at the moment of landfall is, for the duration of the port closure, all the fuel there is, and it is being consumed simultaneously by every system that needs it, faster than it would be consumed under normal conditions, with no resupply arriving to replace what is being used. The arithmetic of that situation does not resolve comfortably regardless of how the numbers are arranged. The paralysis, in other words, is not a metaphor or a rhetorical device or a dramatic framing chosen for effect. It is a specific operational condition with specific time signatures attached to specific systems and specific human consequences that accumulate as each time signature expires. Power fails on a timeline measured in hours. Water pressure fails on a timeline measured in hours after power. Generator fuel depletes on a timeline measured in days. Communications go dark on a timeline measured in days. Medical systems reach crisis standards of care on a timeline measured in days to a week. Fuel shortages reach critical levels on a timeline measured in days to 2 weeks. Port closure extends the inability to replenish any of these resources on a timeline measured in weeks. Each of these timelines is running simultaneously, against the same clock from the moment the eyewall passes. And the limiting factor that runs through every one of those consequences, the single dimension that ultimately determines whether operational paralysis becomes something that recovery eventually addresses, or something that produces a level of secondary harm with no modern American precedent, is not the storm intensity. It is not the surge height. It is not the rainfall accumulation. It is time. How much of it passes between when the cascade begins and when the outside world can reach these islands at the scale the cascade requires? That is the question, and the answer is where this story has been going all along. Part 14. The 72-hour isolation trap. Emergency planners have a concept sometimes called the golden window, the period immediately following a disaster, during which interventions have their highest impact on survival outcomes, and after which the marginal value of additional rescue capacity diminishes because the acute phase is over and the recovery phase has begun. The concept exists because disaster response is not a linear function of resources applied over time. It is a curve with a steep early slope and a flattening tail. A rescue team that arrives 6 hours after a building collapse saves dramatically more lives per unit of effort than a rescue team that arrives 60 hours after the same collapse, not because the later team is less capable, but because the biological reality of human survival under debris, without water, without medical attention, follows a time curve that the response system has to beat. The golden window is the period during which the response system is racing against that curve and winning. After the window closes, the curve has already done most of its work, and the response transitions from rescue to recovery, from saving lives to rebuilding the conditions under which life can be sustained. The window is not a metaphor. It is the specific period during which the decisions made and resources deployed have their maximum return in human survival. And in the Marianas, under the full cascade failure scenario, that window has a structure that no continental United States disaster response framework was built to address. In most continental United States disaster scenarios, the golden window is measured in hours to a few days, and the response system was designed around that measurement. Mutual aid agreements between neighbouring states allow resources to begin moving toward a disaster zone within hours of impact, before the federal declaration is even processed. Before FEMA has stood up its full coordination apparatus, neighbouring state assets are already on the road. National Guard units can be mobilised and on site within a day under standard activation procedures. Federal resources, urban search and rescue teams, medical assistance teams, logistic support can begin flowing within 48 to 72 hours under a well-executed federal response. The system was built on the assumption that the geography cooperates, that there are roads connecting the disaster zone to places where resources exist. that there are neighbouring jurisdictions capable of providing mutual aid, that the distance between where help is and where help is needed is measured in hours of travel, not days. The golden window remains open long enough for the response system to fill it, because the response system was designed for a geography where filling it is physically possible within the biological time frame the window allows. In the Marianas, the golden window has a fundamentally different structure, and the difference is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of the basic physical relationship between distance, time, and the speed at which resources can move across 6,000 miles of open Pacific Ocean. The distance to the mainland means that federal surge resources, the heavy logistics, the bulk supplies, the large-scale personnel deployments, cannot physically arrive in meaningful quantities within the first 24 hours under any realistic mobilization scenario. This is not a criticism of federal response capability, it is arithmetic. Aircraft can move people and small quantities of critical supplies faster than ships, but aircraft capacity is finite and airfield dependent, and the most critical supplies in a cascade failure scenario, fuel in volume, heavy construction equipment, bulk water treatment chemicals, large quantities of food, move by ship, not by air. The fastest ship-based response from the west coast of the United States to Guam takes days, not hours, under the best conditions. Under post-typhoon conditions, with sea states elevated and port facilities potentially damaged, that timeline extends further. The golden window opens at landfall. The ship leaves the dock days later. The arithmetic does not resolve in favour of the people on the islands. Prepositioned assets on Guam are the first line of defence against this geographic reality, and they are the reason the response system has any meaningful capacity to act within the golden window at all. Military assets at Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam, FEMA pre-positioned supplies, military medical capacity and engineering resources represent the only response capability that can reach the affected islands within the first critical hours after the storm passes. The pre-positioning strategy exists precisely because planners understand the distance problem and have tried to solve it by putting resources inside the geographic perimeter before the disaster occurs. It is a sound strategy. Under the baseline scenario, where Guam remains functional while the CNMI absorbs the worst of the storm, it works as designed. But if Guam itself is the disaster zone, under the direct hit scenario or the dual island failure scenario, those pre-positioned assets are either physically damaged by the same storm they were positioned to respond to, committed entirely to immediate local response on Guam where the need is overwhelming, or inaccessible due to the same infrastructure degradation that is defining the regional crisis. The first line of defence becomes a casualty of the event it was designed to address, and the golden window, in that scenario, does not stay open for the response to arrive. It begins closing the moment the storm makes landfall, and the mechanism of closure is not the biological survival curve of trapped survivors. It is the generator depletion clock running inside every critical facility on the island chain. 72 to 96 hours is not an arbitrary number pulled from a planning document to give the timeline a concrete anchor. It is the point at which, under the cascade model applied to the specific infrastructure architecture of the Marianas, the last tier of critical infrastructure protection exhausts its fuel reserves if external resupply has not arrived. The first tier, commercial power, fails within hours of eyewall passage. The second tier, battery backup systems at communications nodes and some critical facilities, fails within 8 to 12 hours. The third tier, generator backup power at hospitals, dialysis centres, emergency operations centres, and major communications infrastructure is the last line. It was designed to bridge the gap between when commercial power fails and when either commercial power is restored or external resupply arrives. In the continental United States, that gap is typically measured in hours to a day or two. In the Marianas, under port closure and airfield uncertainty, that gap is measured in weeks. The generator fuel reserve that was designed as a bridge becomes, in the geographic context of these islands, a finite countdown to the moment when the bridge ends and there is nothing on the other side. What follows the generator depletion threshold is not an immediate descent into chaos. This is important to understand clearly, because the temptation in this kind of analysis is to describe the post-threshold condition as a sudden catastrophic collapse, and that is not what the documented evidence from previous events shows. What the evidence shows is quieter, more insidious, and in some ways harder to respond to than a sudden collapse, precisely because it does not look like an emergency from the outside. It looks like a series of separate, manageable-sounding problems. Critical systems switch to partial operation, running only the most essential functions, shedding load, making internal triage decisions about which services to maintain and which to suspend. Medical care becomes rationed not by medical need but by available resources. The dialysis machine runs for the patients most likely to survive without treatment for another day, not for the patients who need it most, because there is not enough power or water or supplies to run it for everyone. Communications become intermittent and then unavailable as the last generators at the last towers run dry. And the information picture of who needs what and where, the situational awareness that the entire external response apparatus depends on to allocate its limited resources correctly, becomes darker precisely as the need becomes most acute and the consequences of misallocation become most severe. The response system is trying to aim at a target it can no longer see. In a geography it cannot reach quickly, with resources that are still days away from arrival at meaningful scale. Port damage extending harbour operations closure for 2 to 3 weeks is not a pessimistic assumption offered to make the scenario sound worse than it is. It is consistent with historical experience from comparable events across the Pacific, documented in post-storm assessments from Typhoon Pongsona, Super Typhoon Yutu, and other major Western Pacific strikes. Harbour infrastructure, pier structures, crane equipment, navigation aids, fuel handling facilities is vulnerable to storm surge in ways that take time to assess and repair even when the damage is not catastrophic. A harbour that looks physically intact after a typhoon may have surge-deposited debris on the approach channel that requires dredging before large vessels can enter safely. It may have pier damage that limits which classes of vessels can berth. It may have fuel handling equipment that was flooded and requires inspection and certification before it can be safely operated. The 2 to 3 week closure estimate is not a worst case. It is a reasonable central estimate based on the documented recovery timelines from previous comparable events. And during those 2 to 3 weeks, the supply chain into the islands operates exclusively through airlift, dramatically more expensive per ton of cargo, dramatically more sensitive to airfield conditions that are themselves uncertain, and dramatically less capable of delivering the high-volume, heavy supplies that a large-scale recovery requires. Airlift is a critical capability. It is not a substitute for maritime shipping at the volume these islands need. Airfield usability after Sinlaku is not guaranteed, and the uncertainty compounds the port closure problem in a specific and consequential way. Runway surface condition after an eyewall passage depends on whether debris has been deposited on or across the runway, whether flooding has compromised the runway base, and whether the lighting and navigation systems required for instrument approaches are functional. Airport fuel supply depends on whether the fuel farm survived surge and wind damage. Air traffic control functionality depends on powered communications infrastructure that is subject to the same cascade failure as every other powered system on the island. Ground handling capability depends on equipment and personnel that were sheltering during the storm and may not be immediately available in the numbers required for surge operations. All of these conditions have to align simultaneously before meaningful airlift operations can resume. Under a direct eyewall passage, some or all of them may be compromised for a period that is not hours but days. The combination of port closure and airfield uncertainty during that immediate post-storm period creates the specific geographic trap that makes the Marianas fundamentally different from almost every other place where major American disasters have occurred. It is possible, not probable, but physically possible to be cut off, not partially but entirely, with no maritime access and no reliable air access, for a period that runs directly through the generator depletion threshold and into the condition we have been calling operational paralysis. That possibility, low probability, present and consequential, beyond any other single variable in this entire analysis, is the core of what makes the 72-hour window the number that matters more than any wind speed or surge height in this story. It is the number the generators are counting down to. It is the number the biological clocks of the most vulnerable patients are running against. It is the number that determines whether the golden window closes with the response system inside it or outside it. And it raises, with a clarity that no amount of careful probabilistic framing can soften, the question that the entire architecture of this story has been building toward from the first frame. Part 15. The core question. Why is critical American infrastructure, critical American military capability, and a significant American civilian population located in a place where a single atmospheric event can simultaneously destroy the physical environment they depend on, sever the logistics chain connecting them to outside assistance, and leave them in a condition of genuine material vulnerability for weeks or months at a time. This is not a rhetorical question designed to lead to an obvious answer. It is a genuinely complicated strategic and historical question, and the honest answer is that it was not fully thought through, not because the people involved were negligent, but because the risk calculus has shifted around a set of decisions that were made in a different era under different assumptions. The American presence in the Marianas is the product of World War II strategic logic. The islands were seized from Imperial Japan at enormous cost in lives during 1944 and 45, and the strategic rationale was clear. Forward basing in the Western Pacific reduced the distance that aircraft had to travel to reach the Japanese home islands, and it positioned American naval power in the centre of the Pacific theatre. That rationale produced Andersen Air Force Base and the naval installations at Apra Harbour, and those installations created the economic and administrative infrastructure around which the civilian population of Guam and the CNMI grew and organised. The geography was chosen for strategic projection. The risk that came with that geography was accepted as the cost of the position. What has changed is not the geography. The Mariana Trench is still there. The Western Pacific Typhoon Corridor is still there. What has changed is three things: the intensity of the storms being generated by a warming ocean, the complexity and cost of the infrastructure that now exists in the impact zone, and the degree to which the global logistics chains that sustain modern life are difficult to rapidly reconstitute after catastrophic disruption. A military base in 1945 could be operationally restored after storm damage with relatively simple technology and largely locally available labour and materials. A modern military installation with hardened communications, precision navigation infrastructure, aircraft maintenance facilities, and sophisticated fuel and weapons handling systems requires a supply chain of specialised components and expertise that is not on the island and cannot be quickly moved there through a disrupted logistics environment. Typhoon Sinlaku, in the final analysis, is not primarily a story about wind speed or storm surge or seismic coincidence. It is a story about the collision between the strategic geography of the mid-20th century and the atmospheric physics of the mid-21st. It is a story about systems designed for one risk environment operating in another. It is a story about what happens when the things we built in the Pacific to project power outward become the things most exposed to the power nature projects inward. And it is a story that does not end when the storm passes, because the next one is forming somewhere in the Philippine Sea right now, drawing heat from an ocean that is warmer than it was when these islands were first fortified, and the question of whether we have built things in places the planet is not going to stop testing, that question does not have a comfortable answer. The worst case scenario for Typhoon Sinlaku is not really a scenario, it is a condition. It is the condition of being a modern infrastructure-dependent population located at the precise intersection of every natural hazard the Western Pacific can generate, 6,000 miles from the system of support that makes modern life possible, with 72 hours of fuel in the generators and a Category 5 storm about to ask whether any of that was ever a good idea. The storm will pass. The systems it breaks will eventually be repaired. The islands will be rebuilt, as they have been rebuilt before. But the thing that does not get rebuilt, the thing that Sinlaku leaves permanently on the record, is the answer to the question of whether geography is destiny, and whether a civilization sophisticated enough to put bombers in the stratosphere and submarines under the ice is sophisticated enough to reckon honestly with the places it has chosen to stand.